Al Fricker is a proud Djadjurrung man and Associate Professor of Indigenous Knowledges at Deakin. In this episode, we explore his journey, his mission to decolonise education, and how he's driving real-world change in classrooms and communities. From the lands of the Wurundjeri people, this is Stories of Wonder. Al Fricker, welcome to Stories of Wonder.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So you're an academic, researcher and the Associate Director of Teaching and Learning for Indigenous Studies here at Deakin. What does that mean?
That's a big question. So I think, broadly speaking, the Associate Director Learning and Teaching role means that I'm ultimately the person responsible for all of the Indigenous Studies units that we teach across Deakin University. So every year we'll probably work with 1,000 to 2,000 students across all of the units that we offer.
Mm-hmm.
The majority of them are non-Indigenous students, and they have engaged with the discipline because I think many of them recognise that there's a gap in their knowledge and they're looking to fill that gap.
So they have to choose to kind of engage with it. It's not an automatic part. Yeah.
So it depends on the course. So some courses will actually have an introduction unit as a core subject, a core unit, but we do offer it as a minor across many arts degrees. And so students can then opt in to do the 8-unit sequence, and then they get a very robust and rounded knowledge base.
Mm-hmm. So they try and then they can buy.
Yeah, that's it. We're like, the first one's free and then you got to pay for the rest.
First one's on us.
Yeah, get you hooked.
Tell us a bit about your journey into education and academia. Like what led you to Deakin and what you're doing now?
Wow. So when I was going through school, was always a fairly precocious student. Pretty smart kid. Didn't respond well to issues of authority and compliance, and was a bit of a rat bag in secondary school and got myself into a bit of strife here and there.
You?
Yeah. I know.
That doesn't sound like you today.
I'm as shocked as you. Well, yeah, I've reformed myself over the years. And I think two factors that really impacted me was my mum was one of the early women in science graduates back in the late 70s, early 80s at Monash Uni. So she'd gone to university well before I was born. My dad, who is Aboriginal, had dropped out of school early, done a couple of apprenticeships, ran his own business, and actually he started his university journey when I was in my final year of high school. So I actually had him modelling what it looked like to navigate the systems, the structures, the challenges of higher education. And so, yeah, on the one hand, I had sort of a natural kind of clueiness, and I had my parents who were like, you should go to uni because it would be a terrible waste if you didn't. And then had that, I suppose, inspiration from my dad watching him go through that. So I managed to scrape into uni, and then it was just a matter of, I suppose, figuring out the things that I enjoyed and ultimately landed on education.
What did you study first?
My first degree was actually an ancient world studies degree. So I did, back in the old day, it was classics and archaeology and history because I had a real passion for the past, passion for history. Thoroughly enjoyed that. You get to the end of that degree and you're like, right, what jobs are there?
Yeah.
Not many.
Ready for my job.
Woohoo. So I ended up retraining, going back, doing a postgrad education qualification and trained as a history, humanities and mathematics school teacher.
Right.
And so the inspiration for that came from, as being a young person playing a lot of basketball, that was my sport of choice. And then once my playing career had well and truly run its course, I had the opportunity to coach for my local junior basketball club that I played for as a junior as well.
Yep.
And interacting with those young people, I found a real love for teaching and a love for, I was able to replicate a lot of things that I enjoyed about my journey learning and then was able to engage with the young people. And so I thought, well, if I'm doing this for free and I'm enjoying it, potentially I could become a school teacher and get paid to do something that I enjoy.
Yeah.
And so I found myself teaching at Prep to Year 12 school for about 3.5 years.
Right. So it was both primary and secondary all in the one
Yeah. So I was at a community school up in the Dandenongs, and so prep to year 12, they usually topped out about 160 kids, so very, very small school, alternative setting, and I taught everything from prep to year 12. And that was quite a significant learning curve to, because you work with the little ones and you respond to them in particular ways. And then immediately after, I've got the year 12s and you respond to them in a very different way. And if you can't put one hat on and take one hat off, you get a lot of confused faces from the year 12s going. I remember one notorious class, there's a particular clapping sequence that you use to get the attention of the preppies. And then I tried that with the year 12s and they all looked at me and said, we drove to school today, right? I went, oh, sorry, everyone.
Was it the classic?
Spot on.
It was
exactly.
Is that just a universal? Yeah.
That's actually, it's like clapping 101. They teach us that at teacher schools. So
really? Yeah. Is there a whole unit?
Yeah, whole unit.
Semester on clapping.
Yeah. 1, 2, 3, eyes on me, all those classics.
Yeah, I'm imagining these, nearly 18-year-olds or 18-year-olds being like, are you like really?
Are you for real?
Yeah.
And I went,
could you not?
Sorry, everyone. Yeah. To their credit, though, some of them did clap back, which was quite lovely. It ingrained from prep.
I think we've used that in marketing meetings, to be honest with you. Sometimes you do need a little bit of a,
I've seen rooms of academics clap back, if I'm honest.
So that's really interesting. So you've talked a bit about your experience there, and that's just, as you say, like so many different ways that you need to learn how to communicate, because even there's a reason, right, why most learning is separated from your primary school teacher or you're going, to learn how to do secondary school. So many different sort of ways you need to talk to those ages and stages that they're in. You've obviously you would have picked up a lot of that along the way, having to do, prep to year 12. What else did you learn about the education system at that time?
So this was, I think this was a great frustration for me, because what we have in this country is a schooling system. And I think we often conflate education with schooling. And schooling is a very specific way of doing teaching and learning, which potentially may not be the best way of doing it. And so what we have here was, I was in the schooling system for 3.5 years, and it's tough. And since I've left, it's only gotten tougher. And one of the challenges that we have is that within our schooling system, it prioritises 2 things above all else. That is productivity and compliance. And so I found myself navigating the schooling system as a Judge Alrung teacher and finding myself in a really challenging position where I was being required to enforce those same colonial ideologies that underpin what schooling should look like, feel like, whether it's quite punitive at times, whether it can be exclusionary, whether it can be quite, the term that some of my research touches on is that idea of carceral logics. So the same ideas that sit and underpin, a judicial system are often manifesting within a classroom as well. So the classrooms almost feel like a prison in some cases. And that didn't sit well with me. And it certainly didn't sit well when I was working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students as well, saying to the kids, look, I know this isn't right. I know this doesn't feel good, but I have to enforce what I'm doing here. And that was one of the reasons why I thought, you know what, maybe potentially if I step out of the classroom, I might be able to affect some kind of system reform which potentially could support better outcomes for not only Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids, but also non-Indigenous students as well.
And is the kind of tension there that for Indigenous kids, they're outside of the classroom or the education kind of schooling environment, that kind of, those kind of rules and punitive measures and things like that aren't quite the same as it is in their kind of, communities. Whereas for, I guess, most white kids, it is a little bit more understood, and a lot of the rest of their lives is a little bit like that.
I think when we talk in these terms, we always have to be conscious of generalizations.
Yeah.
Because we know that any body of learners are always going to be hugely diverse regardless of what their cultural contexts are. But I think there's a term in education known as cultural capital, which essentially is a term that measures how much your personal characteristics, cultural contexts are in alignment with the schooling environment. And we often see that for groups of students that are potentially marginalised in the broader community, their cultural capital often doesn't match the environment that they're forced to inhabit. I think another aspect as well is that for the better part of 2 centuries, we've had a whole lot of deficit positioning. That is, many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander learners who come into the classroom are seen to be deficient in particular ways, often because of this disconnect. And I think some of my research actually argues that ultimately it's not a matter of being deficit or, and I think one of the most insidious terms in schooling is the idea of learning needs, because if you have a need, it implies that you're needing something that you don't have.
Something special, something extra.
Something in addition to fix you. And what I actually argue is it's not needs so much as expectations. Because when we think about our own learning experience, what I've argued for is that we have to recognise that for all of our young people, the very first teacher in their lives is country. Because from the moment of birth, the very first stimuli that their bodies will receive are the sensations of heat, of mass, of touch, of light, of sound, of all these basic neurological experiences that all ultimately come from country. And then the moments after we've come into this world, we're passed into the hands of mother, father, family. So if country is first teacher, family is then second teacher. As we grow and develop as an infant, we will often interact with extended kin. So then family, broader family, community becomes third teacher. Then and only then do we hit, say, early childhood, for example, where early childhood educators will be our fourth teacher. And then by the time we get to school, we're into teacher number 5.
Yeah, right.
And so when the young ones get to school, they already have quite a fundamental understanding of what learning should look like, should feel like, how it should operate. So they have a whole bunch of expectations that already exist. And then they get into primary school and like, right, playtime is over. Now you have lunch, you have play lunch, you have literacy, you have numeracy, you have activities, you have discipline, you have far more rigid routines that you're maybe struggling to come to terms with. And the little ones are like, well, this isn't how learning's supposed to look like and feel like. And so I think that often where we see that potential challenge and the tension here is because you have a whole lot of unmet expectations that then get usurped around this is school, this is how school looks, this is how it feels, and this is what you have to do to get through.
Let's talk a little bit about decolonising education. It's a big term with a lot of weight to it. What does it mean to you and why is it important?
Geez, that's a big question. So I think the things that we have to recognise here is that education doesn't begin in Australia in 1788 with the arrival of Arthur Phillip and the First Fleet. Education is something that has been occurring on country, on the continent and the adjacent islands for as long as people have been here. So we're talking 60, 70 plus thousand years. When we think about how we experience the bulk of our education today, it is overwhelmingly a schooling system that is a colonial construct. And this comes from a time in Industrial Revolution Europe where the very first secular mass elementary education structures come from European nations. And essentially what they say is we're going to take a significant portion of the workforce because children are no longer in the factories. We're going to put them into a school and we're going to teach them their literacy and their numeracy. So they then will become more productive workers. Now, the capitalist class at the time are pretty mad about that because they're like, well, not only have we lost a whole lot of our workforce, but now you're leveraging taxation on us in order to pay for this free public education. And the offsets in productivity aren't enough because they're a greedy bunch. And so they say, well, we want to have a controlling stake in school. We want schools to more closely resemble workplaces. And we want students who come from schools to be the perfect workers. So this means that schools prioritise above all else productivity and compliance. And so, I used to see it all the time when I was being a bit of a rat bag. I'd roll into school, wrong coloured shoes, fricker, out of uniform. I'd say, yeah, but sir, how does my footwear impact my capacity to learn? And they'd often come at me with the absurdity of going, well, if you can't follow the small rules, how will you ever be expected to follow the big rules? And I'd be a bit cheeky and I'd say, look, I'm not sure that's a legal defence that would hold up in court. I don't think I'd be able to turn around to the judge and say, look, you can't charge me with murder here because back in the high school I couldn't wear the right uniform. So how could you expect me not to kill someone? Like, that's not how this works. But it prioritises those experiences of productivity and compliance. And it's coded into the language of schooling. School work, homework, learning tasks. These are all things that inculcate children into the world of work. And then when we look at how schooling is rationalised, it's all about the economies. For each dollar you invest, you get X number of dollars out. And so even then, schooling itself is boiled down to an economic context. So when we think about decolonising schooling, what we're actually asking ourselves is, what could schooling be if it wasn't solely focused on the world of work? What could schooling look like and feel like if we weren't prioritising compliance and productivity above all else? And this is where, when we start thinking about indigenising education, can actually be a really important aspect. Because I think there's an underlying ideology of schooling that says, if I teach children literacy, if I teach them numeracy, if I teach them STEM, and if I teach them the humanities, they will achieve the capacity to become a good person. But if we were to flip that and say, actually, if I focus on the child and teach them how to be a good person first, that actually enables them to achieve in literacy, in numeracy, in STEM, and in humanities. So potentially we want to try to flip that. When we think about experiences of schooling beyond productivity and compliance, we then actually get to have a proper conversation about lifelong learning that doesn't turn into an experience of lifelong training. Because when you think about your post-school learning experiences, it's to train into a degree or a diploma or a certificate or an apprenticeship. It's to skill you to do a particular job. And then if you've said, well, I want more opportunities, you go, you get more training, and then you can change industries or get promoted or whatever it might be. But rarely do we have the opportunity to learn for the joy of experiencing accomplishment, gaining knowledge and wisdom, gaining insights, critical thinking skills. These are all things that are considered to be less valuable and less desirable because it can't be monetized into a very specific economic outcome.
It's not transactional, like purely transactional.
Exactly right. And so when we think about decolonising education, what my research argues is that we're the oldest continuous cultures in the world. We know that culture is not innate. We know that you're born into culture, you're not born with it. So it stands to reason, therefore, that if we're the oldest continuous cultures, then Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have the oldest learning and teaching knowledges and pedagogies in the world. So why wouldn't we want that to be accessible by all of our students so they can gain the benefits of that too?
So I guess what's the alternative to that? What would an Indigenous education offer, and what's sort of your vision for how that could be kind of integrated across all levels of education?
Well, that's a big question, and I think one of the ways of looking at that comes from insights that we have from pre-colonial practices, which we still know about because many of them still exist in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander contexts. So these are living practices that are experienced every day. And I think it comes down to fundamental questions around how do we conceptualize our relationship with knowledge? Because that's the question ultimately that underpins every part of the learning and teaching experience. So if we've, like in a Western context, experienced knowledge as a commodity, something to be bought, sold, traded, exploited, we talk about, the information economy and all that sort of stuff. We create a context where you've got to pay to play. So if you want to learn the knowledge, you've got to pay the money. And we see that all the time. Or alternatively, you go online and you can get whatever you want for free, and it's pretty sketchy.
Mm.
But when we think about knowledge from many First Nations perspectives, what we're actually asking ourselves is, well, if we're not going to treat knowledge as a commodity, if we're going to consider our relationship with knowledge and our obligations, responsibilities, and relationality to knowledge, then that opens up a context where we can have things like men's business and women's business and elder business, where there will be large parts of it that will be restricted and not allowed to be taught to people of particular characteristics. It means that we view knowledge as something that we are custodians of and responsible for. So it means that we might be teaching in a context where we say, look, it actually doesn't matter how much money you have. I can only teach you this thing if you can demonstrate your capacity to hold it appropriately, your capacity to apply it appropriately, and your capacity to only share it with others who can hold it, apply it, and share it appropriately as well. Because what we have to recognize here is that anything that we teach to anyone that can potentially be something to use for good, we ultimately teach them the inverse, because they could either do the opposite, withdraw it, and they could cause great harm. It would be like if I was starting a theoretical nuclear physics class. Welcome to Professor Fricker's Nuclear Physics Class 101. Today I'm going to teach you how to build a thermonuclear device. Here's the caveat, please don't build a thermonuclear device. In the meantime, I have a budding young supervillain up the back of the lecture theatre rubbing his hands with glee thinking, oh, I'm going to build a bomb and I'm going to hold everybody to ransom, wait till I get my plans back to my secret volcano lair. Now, there's no checks and balances on that. There's nothing that says that that person, beyond just the hope that they're of good character, is going to be able to apply that appropriately and not cause a whole lot of harm. So in that sense, when we think about what education could look like, we teach things to our young people at a time in which they need to know it and at a period of their life where they can hold it appropriately and apply it appropriately. And that shifts everything, you know, a whole range. It means that we center our relationships with the young person primarily to build them as a good person, and then we can look at the discipline-specific knowledge they'll need to know. It means that the learner themselves has the right to curate and select their learning experiences based upon their interests, desires, strengths, proficiencies, whatever it might be. And so we give the great opportunity to say to our young people, well, look, if this is something you're interested in, let's nudge you into that direction and you can explore that further. And even something as simple as shifting the question from what would you like to do when you grow up into something more like what kind of a person would you like to be when you grow up? And that could be an incredibly powerful experience for a young person who's not really sure what careers they want to do.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you put it in that context of so much of our schooling is based around pumping out workers, and it's almost it's the complete inverse of that, really, like trying to create an efficiency of scale of just like get them in and get them in at this age and the same, they all get the same, you know, education, and it sticks where it sticks and it doesn't where it doesn't. And the rest is sort of, you know,
you hope for the best.
Up to them, you know.
Exactly.
Whereas this considers the person and it repositions what education means to life rather than...
Exactly right. And I mean, the absurdity of the schooling system that we have today is it's like an arbitrary 13 years.
Yeah.
And that was set by a framework that said by the time you hit 18, you need to be a productive member of society, or you need to be in future training to become an even more productive member of society. And so we have this absurdity where we say, happy birthday, up you go. And the kids go, but I'm not ready. And they go, well, too bad, you got 13 years, get it done. And then we have the absurdity of people saying, oh, too many of our kids are falling behind. So, well, who set the pace? Why does there have to be the pace? Or they go, oh, falling through the cracks. Who put them there? Anything that exists in the system only exists because a person put it there. And equally, we can reform it and we can remove it. It's just a matter of will, not necessarily a matter of ability.
So you've contributed yourself to curriculum reform. You were recently published in your first textbook, I believe. Tell us a little bit about your work there and also the process of getting published in a textbook. I'm sure it was, it's been an interesting kind of thing to go through.
Definitely. So I think this speaks to the frustrations I had when I left teaching. I'm like, look, if I'm in a classroom, I can have an impact at a certain level. If I move beyond the classroom, potentially I can actually broaden that impact.
Mm. And so you did 3 years of
3.5 years in the classroom, and
Yeah.
then I was well and truly ready to move on to something else. And I did my time in the trenches, as it were. I've got that lived experience. I know how tough it is out there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when I think about decolonising, I sort of look at it in sort of 5 major focus areas. So we look at Aboriginal education policy as sort of a factor that underpins everything, because as a teacher, your 2 justifications for what you do in the classroom has to be policy and evidence.
Mm-hmm.
You have to say, I'm doing this thing because it says I should do this thing in the policy, or I'm doing this thing because I can see clearly it's working.
Mm.
And those are the things that teachers must use in order to justify how they work in the classroom. So we consider policy. Then we consider the pedagogies we use in the classroom, which simply speaking is how we transmit knowledge, which is basically a fancy way of saying how to take what's in my head and put it into your head.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have to think about curriculum. So what are we teaching and why? Then we have to think about the physical place and space of the school. Is this something that we can have the flexibility around? Have we integrated technology appropriately? Are there spaces that make visible Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander contexts? You'd be amazed at the number of schools that still have various groupings within the school, be they for athletics, carnivals or swimming days or whatever it might be, that are named after old dead white men. Still quite a common experience.
Mm.
And then it's about community engagement. So who are we engaging with from the local community? Who are we engaging with to bring into the kids or take the kids out to see them, and what kind of stories and knowledges are they having the opportunity to share? So these are sort of the 5 practical ways that schools can think about how they might want to begin decolonising their classrooms. But in terms of my own journey, seeking to create system-wide change, I've tried to position myself across as many different levels as possible. So occasionally I have schools reach out and say, hey, can you run stuff for the kids? And I'm like, oh, yes, please. Because one thing I miss about teaching is interacting with the kids.
Mm.
Some schools will approach me and say, can you please do some professional learning for us? And so I'll come in and work with the teachers and the staff at the school. I've had the absolute honour of being able to be working directly with VCAR, which is the Victorian Curriculum Authority, and support the design of the new Victorian Curriculum 2.0.
Wow. Yep.
And then working beyond that in terms of curriculum resource development, which is speaking back to the textbooks and being able to engage that and saying, well, even if we have a teacher who lacks confidence, if they have a quality resource that they're able to engage with, potentially that will hopefully mean that there's better experiences for the kids. Even if they read it verbatim off the page, it's something, because otherwise it could have been nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think working in that textbook space has been a really interesting experience for me. I think I've been incredibly lucky because the organisation that I've worked with to create those textbooks have been incredibly forward-thinking. Because at the very start of that sort of exchange, I said, look, if you want me to put my name to something, you have to recognise that I am going to be held responsible by community. And if anything's put out that doesn't sit well with community, they're going to reach out to me and say, what the hell?
Mm.
So I said, look, in terms of editorial control, I need you to just trust that I'm going to put together something that is going to be authentic, quality, appropriate, the whole lot. And to their credit, they said, look, could we at least make it connect to the curriculum? I'm like, oh yeah, that's the starting point. Of course we'll make it connected to the curriculum, but I'm going to be looking to push the envelope and put extra stuff that I think should be in there that isn't, that will enhance the learning experiences for the kids and build their knowledge. And they went, you know what? Let's do this. We are prepared as an organisation to create market-leading resources that start to inspire other textbook creators to do more and do better. And that's what we did. And the textbook became one of the best sellers in Victoria, and it's just been published in New South Wales as well.
Nice.
And now we're finding other textbook publishers are starting to catch on and go, oh, maybe we should lift our game as well. And so we're seeing broader curriculum resource development as well. And then with the new national curriculum, my primary focus in the first edition was the Year 10 civil rights content. Mm-hmm. And we found that we'd gone beyond what was already in the curriculum. And then when the new curriculum came out by the feds, we sort of did a bit of a comparison and realised that potentially we didn't have to do a hell of a lot more in the book because most of it that we'd gone beyond had just caught up. And so it was great. It was lovely just to tick off a whole lot of spreads and be like, I don't have to do anything here. We're now pretty much on the money. Now, I have no evidence to suggest that there was ever any kind of interaction between the textbook and then what the curriculum designers did. And there's a lot of governance and oversight and various committees and whatnot.
Yeah.
But it was lovely to see where we'd push the envelope start to be reflected in that national curriculum offering and then by extension into the Victorian curriculum offering as well.
Yeah, that's really powerful. And it shows the power of, there's only so many Alfricas and so much time, and so much of you to go around physically, and do this, but the power of content and working it into the system and empowering teachers to be able to, you can do the work of this even if you're not, yourself fully around it or confident with it. Here's a resource.
It's exactly right. And because we have a generation of teachers who went through their schooling and potentially didn't get this information.
Yeah.
And so what we know is that from the literature, there's often quite a powerful phenomenon in the classroom, which is known as teacher identity, which is many teachers get drawn to the profession because they had a good time at school. Mm. And so part of how they operate is wanting to replicate those good times for their students. And if those good times meant that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander content was absent, potentially that can be recreated in those classrooms. So by having really solid curriculum resources, we actually say to them, look, you might feel a bit anxious about this. You might feel a little bit unsure. You may not have a lot of confidence, but you've got something that has been produced in partnership with community, with First Nations voices, which is accurate, which is authentic, which is quite generous. And I'm not speaking of my own. I'm speaking more broadly across the sector because there's a lot of mob who are doing some wonderful work here, making these beautiful resources. So lean into them and know that if something doesn't quite hit the mark or goes a bit awry, it's already been vetted. So you don't have to worry too much about becoming culturally unsafe because all the checks and balances are already there. You're just the person who's reading it out in the classroom.
Talk to me about that kind of strategy of making this change happen where you need to sort of embed it into a curriculum. I think you're potentially doing something similar here at Deakin as well, making it a part of it and almost like something that becomes a requirement rather than an optional, nice to have. What's the power of that and what's the strategy behind that?
So I find myself occasionally at odds with colleagues because I am a big fan of mandating. And my justification to this is looking at the concept of seatbelts. So when I was a kid, me and my sister, my grandma would buckle us into the car and take us down to the shops. And she started driving in a period where seatbelts were optional. And so my sister and I would watch her travel all the way down her driveway, all the way to the end of her street. And then reluctantly, she was about to turn onto the main road, chuck on a seatbelt. And we'd be like, no, you got to buckle up. It's a big deal. And what we know from the research is that we'd had decades of evidence that showed that seatbelts saved lives. Mm-hmm. And we had education campaigns. And then the point where it actually became a widespread practice was only after it became mandated, where if you didn't buckle up, you'd get a fine. Mm. And then you fast forward a couple of generations, and if any of us were to get into a vehicle today and not buckle up, everybody else in the car would look at us and go, well, what are you doing? And they wouldn't say, because you might get a ticket. They'd say, because you might die in a car crash. Like, buckle up. Safety first. Mm. And so if we take that approach to curriculum reform, assessments, engagement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander contexts, I sort of say, look, as wonderful as it would be to put forward all the evidence to show that this supports the outcomes, all learners, everybody does better and creates a better society. We've known this for decades and haven't really had a huge amount of traction. Mm. So what if we find ways to mandate content into units that essentially, for want of a better term, force the hand of someone who potentially may not have thought about it or may not have been comfortable doing it or may not have wanted to do it and require them to have a go. And so part of the Glow 8 strategy that I put forward last year, I was invited to present the keynote at last year's Glow 8 Symposium. And I said, well, potentially an option that we might use here is to recognise that we have absolutely deadly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff members at Deakin who are more than happy to support this work. And maybe what if we changed the assessment rubrics to require unit chairs to get students to cite Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander scholarship as part of the research component in their assessments? Because what that would then do is essentially say, right, well, if you're going to ask the students to cite First Nations researchers, maybe you should include some of those First Nations researchers onto their reading list so they actually interact with them as part of their unit, so that you're not just saying, well, good luck to you, try and find the answers, because that's not fair for the students. And if we're going to be including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander researchers and scholarship in our reading list, maybe we should look at that as a weekly topic. And that then gets us started so that we now start to create a context where in the short to medium term, we'll have units where they'll have potentially one dedicated week per unit where they're engaging with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledges through Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research scholarship. And then from that, we create a strand where when we ask our graduates at the end of their programs, what are some of the things that really stuck out to you? They go, I actually can't remember a time where I didn't have a unit that didn't engage with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander content. And potentially, as we become more comfortable, as we become more capable in this space, we get the chance to say, well, you've got 1 week. Why not 2? Why not 3? And then we start creating a really strong stranded narrative through all units, through all programs. And then we have that really solid basis where our graduates can go out into industry and have that prerequisite knowledge already and start to change the way that they work.
Yeah, really pulling the thread.
And so you got to use the policies that already exist.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's great. You've kind of used the system and the rules of the system to then change the system, but with a view to, like, with an outcome rather than it is, the rules are the rules and that's that.
Exactly right. And it's about, I suppose, acknowledging that to decolonize is to feel quite uncomfortable because it is unsettling. It's the work of the scholarship of the likes of Frantz Fanon, who talks about decolonial praxis being equally as violent as colonial praxis. And so we have to make the distinction between what is physical and non-physical violence. So I'm not advocating that, all the mob should get their bundies and go out there and clobber white fellas until they leave.
Yeah.
What I'm saying here is that we have to prepare non-Indigenous staff, comrades who want to sort of come with us to recognise that they're going to feel uncomfortable at times. And so when we start using those sort of policy settings to start to encourage people to reform, we create, I think, potentially far gentler ways of being able to get them to start engaging than ways that immediately get their backs up and they start getting defensive and start, railing against it. And that the psychology of decolonizing is really, really tricky and really, really complex. And I don't think even I have a handle on that yet.
Yeah. Well, talk to me a little bit more about that. Is discomfort, just a necessary part of this kind of a process? And, what role does it play in, forcing people to really reckon with it? And is it a distraction sometimes?
I think it is a necessary part because in all the scholarship around decolonial praxis, the language that they describe how it works, they talk about it as being unsettling, disquieting, discomforting, things that create a disequilibrium in people. So they have their ways of thinking, feeling and acting in the world that potentially are quite colonial in their application, in their mindset. And then when you start to say, well, hang on a second, there's some other ways that you can think, feel and act in the world, but the only way you can access them authentically is you actually have to be prepared to start critiquing, pulling apart and dismantling some of the things that are central to you and what you've held as truth and core to your being. And I don't think it matters whoever you are. That's going to be an uncomfortable experience to have to sort of critique, question, and reflect on those aspects. And I think what we also disregard, and I think being Djadja and as many First Nations people of Australia, we get the privilege of being able to contrast community ways, pre-colonial ways, and then neo-colonial ways. And what we know is that as much as decolonial praxis has to be uncomfortable, it also has to be intersectional. So what I mean by that is that if we did a cross-section of our community and calculated, right, who are the groups that get marginalised? So we've got LGBTIQ+, we've got people with disabilities, we've got women and the patriarchy, we've got poor people, people in poverty, the list goes on. And when we think about the fact that women have always existed on the Australian continent, the J Islands, LGBTIQ+ people have always been here, albeit conceptualised in very different ways.
Yep.
We've always had people with disabilities who've lived in Australia. As we have the oldest languages, we also have the oldest sign languages in the world as well. And so none of these characteristics that are inherent to a person and who they are was an issue until Captain Cook rolled up in 1770 and then Arthur Phillip again in 1788. So when we think about the role of decolonial praxis, we actually have to acknowledge that all the ways that we marginalise people in our community are all colonial constructs, and it doesn't have to be like this at all. And so what I sort of say is that if we're going to decolonise authentically, we have to experience the discomfort. And some responses I've had to those people say, oh, well, I need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. I'm like, well, potentially not, because the moment you become comfortable, you're not uncomfortable anymore.
Yeah.
And the analogy I like to say is, well, maybe we should use exercise as an analogy, in that I exercise, I feel uncomfortable. I get breathless, hot, sweaty, tired. And then I keep exercising. And then when I no longer feel like that when I exercise, it's not having the desired effect. I'm not getting any fitter. I'm not getting any stronger. I'm not getting any healthier. I'm just maintaining. But I don't look at exercise and think, God, my heart is racing. I'm short of breath. I'm sweaty. Am I having a heart attack? I'm like, yeah, I know that's because I'm hot and sweaty from exercising. So it's about becoming familiar with the discomfort rather than comfortable. It's about recognizing that it is going to happen. It is going to come, and leaning into that. It's also about, I think, navigating the challenges here around the context of things like white guilt. Because I often have well-meaning non-Indigenous people come up to me occasionally and they go, I just feel so terrible. I'm so sorry for everything that happened. And I'm like, look, I appreciate that, but with respect, the way that you feel right now and how guilty you feel in no way changes my material existence, my experiences of racism or discrimination, or the impacts that this has on my community. So potentially, maybe rather than looking at that feeling of guilt, translating that into action might be the best way forward as well. And these are often some of the pitfalls. So in the initial context, you find that people will feel that discomfort and they might push back and they say, you know what, I would have been behind you the whole way, but now you've made me feel really uncomfortable, so I don't want a bar of it. I'm like, well, with respect, potentially I don't think you were probably in to begin with if the way that I've made you feel is the factor in you opting out of this struggle. And then, when we get mired in that white guilt, it's about saying, look, I appreciate that you're experiencing this viscerally and emotionally, but ultimately that doesn't necessarily translate into action. And I'm here to get results. And so I suppose the third element is about recognizing that we need to build consciousness around a shared liberatory struggle, in that I want to support better outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids. I want better outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, but I also want better outcomes for everyone. And when we think about the literature, when we estimate the amount of time spent toiling to cover all the basic requirements before colonisation. Now, I don't say work, because work has a very specific capitalist connotation. But we're in an environment now where we're smashing out 30, 40-hour weeks, if we're lucky, and potentially barely making ends meet. But before colonisation, we estimate it was between 20 and 25 hours per week spent toiling to cover housing, food, clothing, so on and so forth. I would really like to live like that again. I would really like to be able to live the same way as my ancestors did. But beyond that, I'd like everybody to live like that as well. Not just me, not just my community. We should be in the ocean eating fruit. We should be dancing and singing and creating and doing the things that are not work-related that fill us with joy. That's what we should be doing. That's why we exist. And when we are stuck grinding and barely making ends meet and experiencing precarity within the system, we don't give ourselves the opportunity to experience things for the sake of experiencing them. When we have a colonial mindset where you can't claim to be a thing unless your skill set is good enough to monetize, that's incredibly limiting. Yeah, and we see that in the classroom all the time. You go, kids go, I can't draw. And I say, can you pick up a pen? Yeah. Can you scribble something on a page? Yeah. Kid, you can draw. And they go, yeah, but it's not very good. I said, quality doesn't matter. That doesn't stop you from being able to do a thing. But we have this colonial mindset where quality is the defining factor on whether you can and cannot do something. And once you start limiting yourself, it becomes really quite damaging in the long term.
Such interesting points there about how work and identity are just so sort of one and the same, really, whereas that wasn't necessarily how it always was or what it could be.
Totally.
Talk to me a little bit about both sidesism in this kind of work. Has it gotten worse recently? Has it always been there? And I don't know, why do you think that it is brought up?
So I think the challenge that we have from a Western perspective of knowledge, when we treat knowledge as a commodity, is we seek to remove its capacity for bias. So if we're only treating it as a commodity, knowledge is rendered powerless. It has no power to influence. It has no power to impact. It's all about the money. And so you run into the risk of saying, well, if we're creating ideas of knowledge as being apolitical, then one of the ways that we, the two ways we can be apolitical is we can say, right, I'm just going to talk about, say, history, for example, facts, figures, times, dates, and people. That's it. Just what happened. I'm not going to bother asking the question why. And anybody who's a history teacher knows that the answer, the real questions you're going to ask about the past is, why is this stuff happening? And so another way of trying to maintain an apolitical stance is saying, well, I'm going to give you the pros and I'm going to give you the cons. And the absurdity is that we've had cases, not in Australia specifically, but certainly overseas, where they're like, right, we want you to list 3 negatives of slavery and 3 positives of slavery. And this kind of both sidesism can be incredibly problematic because it muddies the waters. And we're actually just allowed to say, slavery is just bad, just straight up, unequivocally. We've had wars about this. We've had numerous periods in history where it shows that slavery in all its forms is actually just a bad thing.
Yeah.
And so when it comes to higher ed, in the units that I teach, sometimes students sort of say, well, hang on a second, this feels kind of biased. I'm like, well, yeah, I'm not here to try and claim that there were good things to come out of colonisation, because anything you can tell me that's a plus could have potentially been achieved without the genocide that underpinned the colonisation of Australia. So, one of the reductive comments is saying, well, if we didn't colonise this country, then you wouldn't have shoes, you wouldn't have cars, you wouldn't have hot showers. And I'm like, okay, yeah, fair. But England has all of those things. They weren't colonised in the 18th century. So I'm not sure that is a process that is necessary to achieve technological advancement. So when we're in this space, when I'm in this space, I say, look, I'm not going to be apolitical here, but I have integrity and transparency. So I'm going to let you know that this is going to be super biased. It's going to be super left-wing. It's going to be ultra woke, super Marxist. I'm an angry Aboriginal activist academic. And that's where I stand. And you can either accept that for what it is at face value, or you can say, I'm a little uncomfortable with this, and then we'll try and navigate our way through it. But I'm not going to sit here and in good faith, in good conscience, tell you that there were good things that came from colonisation, because I unequivocally believe that is not the case.
Yeah. Let's pull that thread a little bit more. Like, what does it mean these days to be an Indigenous educator and researcher in predominantly non-Indigenous spaces?
So this is the part that speaks to sometimes the toll that this takes on us. And I know I'm not unique in this place. I know that there are a lot of other absolutely deadly First Nations scholars across higher ed, secondary teaching, primary teaching, early childhood, the whole system who are doing it tough. And if I think about my own journey, I think about who I am and what I would love to do. And the fact is, anybody who knows me knows that I love a laugh, I love a joke, I love having a good yarn, spinning a good story, hanging out, just enjoying the interaction and the comfort that comes from feeling like you belong with others. And that's what I want to create in the classroom when I'm teaching. But I have to acknowledge that whether I like it or not, I can't be just that teacher or just that storyteller or just the person who seeks to impart wisdom and insight. Every day I have to strap on my cultural armour because I know I'm walking into a colonised space with people who may not necessarily be acting in good faith, who may have been stuck in that Western onto epistemology where they're like, this is the way the world works and anything is unscientific and has no value. And so I can't separate that. So I have to strap on the armour and I have to be prepared to sit across tables from people, firing bullets, holding people to account, calling out racism, all the things that take the toll. And my experience as a school teacher, I taught maths for a couple of years and I still have vivid memories of the kids going, I'd walk into a maths class and I go, I hate maths. And I go, you know what? That's no skin off my nose, kiddo. If you don't like it, that's fine. It's not everybody's cup of tea. I just got to make sure that you're functionally numerate at the end of this so that when you have to do maths in your future, like things like budgeting, bank loans, whatever, you have enough to know you're not getting, screwed over.
Yeah.
Basically, you're not being, having your stuff stolen. But when I walk into a class and I have students go, I hate Indigenous studies. Not that that's ever happened, but there's occasional, pushback, occasional. They're never so open as that. I can't separate myself from that discipline.
Yeah.
It is a part of me. It's a part of who I am. It's a part of who our team is. And to have that rejection of the discipline, whether we like it or not, is a rejection of us as well. And that takes a particular toll. When we cover a lot of our content, we don't shy away from the darkness of Australia's history. We don't shy away from the genocide, the massacres, releasing smallpox and all the terrible things that happen from that. And that too takes a toll because you can't help but feel sad teaching about that stuff. And so we've got to put on our armour and we've got to roll in and be prepared, to endure the cut and thrust of teaching and learning in higher ed. And at the same time, I think we're incredibly lucky because we are here by virtue of our communities who support us 110%, who've made it very clear that higher education is a place where we need to be, where our young people need to be, and we have a responsibility as custodians, because I'm not the first person who's been the Associate Director of Learning and Teaching. I am just in that chair for now. I'm a custodian of what this position represents, and it's my job to keep everything ticking over and potentially whoever comes afterwards will hopefully have a bit of an easier time with systems and structures and all that sort of stuff. And so I have to be constantly aware that I am responsible to the expectations of the community as well, and that I have to honour all the students and all the knowledge and all the learning that happens so we all benefit from that as well.
You've spoken about it a little bit here or there. How do you maintain authenticity and resilience for, and how long can you kind of do that for in a role like this?
I mean, authenticity is not necessarily something I've ever had an issue with.
It doesn't. It doesn't. I'm sure our viewers at home have picked up on that.
I think it's helpful in terms of authenticity because occasionally I will be involved with various initiatives, projects around the state, and it doesn't matter often how reasonable, how measured, how considered, how much evidence there is. There's a portion of the community who will try and call me out saying that I'm a cultural Marxist, that I'm ultra woke and I'm terrible and trying to, brainwash the young generation. And my philosophy is like, well, if I'm going to cop that anyway, I may as well lean into it and go, well, I could be quite conservative in my outlook. I could be quite conservative in my projects. I'm going to cop the blowback anyway, so I may as well get my money's worth, as it were, and lean into that. So that's why I try to be as authentic as I can. And coming from a largely working class background, from an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander background, I think I have an opportunity to really challenge some of the expectations and experiences of higher education. And I may or may not drop the occasional swear word into a classroom when I'm feeling particularly fired up and passionate.
Goodness.
And I often get feedback from the students going, "You are unlike any of our other instructors." And I go, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And they're like, no, this is great. We really like it. Mm-hmm. And so I think that authenticity helps to ensure that we actually have really positive and impactful learning experiences as well. Mm-hmm. So I'm not just here just following through, going through willy-nilly and not, if the students are prepared to honour me with their presence, I want to honour them by giving them the best and the most that I can give them in the short time that I have them for. In terms of resilience, I mean, that's a big question, and I'm not sure I'm very good at that because it does take its toll. I think being proactive in terms of accessing mental health support is something that's really helped me along this journey. I think having a really wonderful supportive team at Naikiri full of mob and non-Indigenous comrades who get it means that some days after just a particularly harrowing class, I can just come in, let it all out and just be myself and be authentically myself and know that that's not going to come back with any sort of negative repercussions. And as I sort of alluded to earlier, I think knowing that you've got community, knowing that you have their support and honouring them means that you are never far away from the answer to the question, why am I here? Why am I doing this? Because you have community who say, we can see you are a success. We can see you're working so hard, and we know that our young people will benefit from accessing higher education, from accessing Naikiri or any other university and being able to succeed in these places. And that heartens me a lot. And that's something that I really cherish very deeply. And I'm also kind of nervous about as well because I don't want to screw it up.
Pressure's on, the expectations there.
That's it.
And so how long can you do this for, or do you want to do this for? And what would be next, I guess, to keep, if you want to continue the same mission, which I'm sure you do, but in a different way?
Look, at the end of the day, I have no desire to leave because at this stage in my career, I'm not sure what I'd do if I wasn't doing this. I think I'd be a bit lost. There's a lot of work to be done, and there will continue to be a lot of work to be done into the future. I mean, we have a phenomenon in this country where the first university was established in the 1850s. It took us until the late 1950s to get our very first Aboriginal graduate from a university. So we've got over 100 years of inertia, just in higher education alone, forget about the rest of colonisation for a moment, that we have to overcome. And I think, there's that proverb, the master's tools will never be able to dismantle the master's house. I don't necessarily ascribe to that because if that were the case, there would have been no reason to exclude us from higher education for 100 years before we got into it. Like knowledge is power, let's be real, because it's not the master's tool that matter, it's whose hands are wielding them in the moment. And so I have every desire to stay where I am and to see this continue, to continue to reach out to community, to build the number of successful Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students who we work with, to recognise that we are not just supporting and holding young people and of course many mature age students as well who are coming into the university, but by extension we're holding communities as well because they come in, they do some learning, they achieve some qualifications, and then they immediately go into the community and they're building communities. They're supporting the young people there. They're creating positive spirals that build the numbers of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students accessing higher education. They're building an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, entrepreneurial middle class. They're allowing us to be successful within the systems that we're forced to endure, but at the same time ensure that we're able to maintain our authentic cultural selves and the principles that underpin those. And that is a great responsibility, and that is something that I'm going to be more than happy to continue to do until such time as, someone might tap me on the shoulder and say, I think it's time to move on now. And I'll go, okay, fair enough. And maybe, I don't know, I'll go stack shelves at Woolies or something like that.
Look out for Al at Woolies. We're near the end of this, but just a couple of quick fire questions to wrap up. Who's someone you look up to?
Oh, gosh. I mean, I think it would be weird if I didn't say my dad. I think one of the things I love is that he works with me at Naikiri, and he actually was here first, and he was one of the big reasons why I came to Deakin and to Naikiri, because he's like, this place is great. Come along, everyone's amazing. You'll be great. You'll be amazing. And the time that I've been here, I've had such wonderful success. And it's been just a wonderful journey, an exhausting journey, but a wonderful one. I think that there are key elders in the community that are too numerous to name, who at various times of my life have, in moments of concern or crisis, have kind of taken me under their wings and really supported me and my own journey, my own cultural identity, my experiences of authenticity. I think all the deadly young people that I get to interact with, be they primary school kids, secondary kids, students who I've engaged with who are engaging in their university journey, and they're such deadly mob, and they are so driven, and they are such wonderful, wonderful people who are going to go out and do the most amazing things, and to be just a small part of that journey and to try and help them as much as I can, and honour the help that I've received from all those elders who've looked after me as well. And I think, thinking about country as well, and recognising that, colonisation meant that my family had to leave country, and I was grown up on Wurundjeri country, and I was nourished by Wurundjeri country, and I was looked after by the plants and the animals and the dreaming and everything that's part of that. And I want to make sure that I work to instill those same values and reinforce them in all the students who I work with. But it's just, and I suppose finally as well, the leadership that we have here at Deakin, the absolutely deadly mob who are inhabiting those, top spots, who are in the big chairs, who are advocating day in and day out, and many of whom have been in this sector for decades, who have had such impact for such a long time, and who definitely broke the ground, blazed all the trails, and who are the reason why I am here today doing what I'm doing. And I just hope that I can live up to their expectations and honour them and their efforts by, doing my part. So I got a bit emotional there. Goodness.
It's welcome. Well, what do you do to unwind? Let's loosen this up a little bit.
Oh, look, I enjoy spending time with family. I have a nephew and a gaggle of nieces who I just absolutely adore, and I love just connecting with them. Wherever possible, I try and get up onto Dja Dja Wurrung country and sort of take my shoes off and go for walks and just take a moment to really listen and think and feel and reflect. I probably play too many video games, if I'm honest.
What are you playing at the moment?
I just recently bought myself a PlayStation 5, so I've got a couple of PlayStation 5 games that I'm sort of getting into, mostly first-person shooters and strategy games and things like that. So it just helps me switch off for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And then wherever I can, I try and sort of exercise and get out and do that as well.
Yeah. I think you might have answered it there, but you have a favourite place?
Oh, country. Definitely country. Anywhere sort of in that sort of central goldfields region of Victoria, as soon as I get onto country, I feel like a weight just comes off. Hearing the animals, the birds, feeling the wind, touching the trees, the earth, the soil. There's nothing quite like it. And having the opportunity to feel held by the ancestors in that space is something that I definitely cherish, and it means a lot.
I'm glad to hear that. Alfrika, thank you so much for being on Stories of Wonder.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a delight.